The next call is a split call. Dr. David Clark, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to invoke in this debate the famous sermon of Rutherford Waddell, known as the Sermon on the Sin of Cheapness. It was a sermon that transformed working and living conditions for a swathe of working New Zealanders a century ago. It was delivered on a Sunday morning in early spring 1888 by a Dunedin church minister who spoke to his congregation about sweated labour and the sin of covetousness. Reverend Waddell was a skinny Irish Presbyterian minister with a slight speech impediment, but he brought about some significant social change. He did it from the context in which he worked, an area known as the Devil's Half Acre back then. It's actually in my electorate, where Princes Street, Maclagan and Maitland Streets align. It was an area of poverty, cheek by jowl, bars, gambling, opium dens and the like. People brought together by poverty. That was what they had in common. In 1880, he started work in that area and set up a food bank, an association to run a food bank. By the end, a decade later, he'd set up a free library, a savings bank, and New Zealand's first free kindergarten with the help of a parishioner. He was a man who talked, but his actions spoke louder still. It's his spirit that I believe was captured in what the founders of the Labour Party called applied Christianity. He was concerned particularly about the wages which were less than subsistence wages that were being paid to seamstresses in his area, and they were the topic of part of his sermon. He believed that there was both a spiritual and moral imperative to fight against the evil of forcing down wages below what people could live off in order to ensure the profitability of manufacturing. The claims he made in the sermon were picked up by the Otago Daily Times, and the editor of the day sent along his chief reporter who investigated those claims and found they were perfectly true. From there, a royal commission was established, or subsequently at least, and Mr. Waddell was appointed one of its members. And the reason that I bring this up here today is because he challenged the working conditions of the day that were driving down and down and down and down, and were not allowing for sufficient income for those families living in poverty to live in dignity. This is part of an ongoing battle in our society. Back then, he recognised that New Zealanders didn't want the wealth and poverty extremes that they had experienced in the countries they'd come from. But, Mr. Speaker, that is the direction we're heading in again, and with much legislation coming to this House, we see employment conditions further undermined. So, Mr. Speaker, with that invoking of the sin of cheapness sermon in mind, I see that today we have a bill before us that wants to promote consumerism at any cost, that wants to make everything available all the time at no extra cost. And those who will be forced to respond as workers to this bill, the people that work, that live on low wages in New Zealand, will have few choices. We know that's their reality. They have to work the hours that their employers ask them to meet rent, to meet power, and to preserve their employment, to meet family obligations, and so on. We have a problem ongoing in this country. There is a cost from this kind of legislation that falls on families, that falls on human dignity, and that falls on social engagement and social capital. We as New Zealanders, I believe, have to challenge this kind of legislation when it comes to the House. This is not the New Zealand that we want. The New Zealand that undermines the few days that are left for people to be sure they can spend time in common with friends and families, that they can maintain social bonds, that they can build social capital, that they can create the kind of society that I wish to live in, that I am sure many New Zealanders wish to live in. In the 1950s, an ordinary storeman, and they mostly were, on the shop floor could earn enough with a weekly wage packet to support a family on his own and also to hold down a mortgage. A storeman in Mitre 10, I suggest today, would not be able to manage that. Mr. Speaker, we live in a society where zero-hour contracts are maintained, where precarious workers are forced to do things they shouldn't do. I will be voting against this legislation, and I encourage others to do so.
The Honourable Damien